Before the operating room is opened, a long table stands beneath the high windows. Instruments lie in a shallow tray. Linen has been folded. A bottle of carbolic solution waits near the door, its smell sharper than lamp oil and soap. The room is not yet modern, and the people in it do not have a complete explanation for infection. They have observations, failures, and a suspicion that the unseen world around a wound matters. Joseph Lister's work belongs to that uncertain interval when cleanliness was becoming a method rather than a matter of appearance. In such a room, order is caution. The table is plain, built for endurance, and set in open light so every hand movement can be seen. Beside it are the tray, a basin, and towels, folded until their edges feel familiar. Nothing is lavish. The room wants to be serviceable, to keep the floor clear, to keep the path from door to table free of clutter, and to keep the work moving. Every object has a place, and every routine implies a belief about what is safe. Before antiseptic surgery becomes established, an operation can end well and still leave the patient in danger afterward. That danger comes later, in heat, swelling, foul discharge, fever, and the slow failure of a wound that first seemed to be healing. In the wards, infection can travel with ordinary speed, so success at the table does not guarantee survival in bed. The surgeon knows this in the practical way repeated disappointment teaches. A clean cut is only the beginning. The days after the knife matter just as much, and the room is tied to the next dressing, the next turning, and the next look at the bandage. Anesthesia has already changed surgery's rhythm. Pain is no longer the only measure of what the body can bear, so longer procedures become possible and more of the body can be reached. But the longer the wound stays open, the more time trouble has to arrive. Comfort expands what surgery can attempt, while safety still lags behind. Infection remains unsettled. Bad air, dirt, the hospital itself, drainage, crowding, the condition of the room. The surgeon works with clues rather than certainty. A wound that fails becomes a lesson after the fact. Good recovery is reassuring, but it does not explain itself. In that uncertainty, observation gains dignity. A basin rinsed one way, a cloth folded another, a hand washed more carefully than before. Small differences begin to matter because no larger truth has settled the question. Hands are the most obvious instruments in the room and also the least trustworthy. They carry skill, but they also carry whatever the day has left on skin and sleeve. So the wash basin becomes a threshold. Water runs over fingers, soap cuts the grease, and cloth dries the skin. Cleanliness enters by repetition, not ceremony. Carbolic washing adds another layer of caution. The surgeon, the dresser, the nurse, and the assistant all share the same problem. The body is being opened, and whatever touches that opening has consequence. The instruments answer to the same pressure. Metal is easier to imagine as clean than wood or ivory. Though imagination is not enough, a polished blade, a forceps, a saw must be laid down, picked up, and set aside with attention. The tray is a working map of sequence. One tool follows another. One motion prepares the next. If an instrument has rested in a carbolic bath, been wiped, or placed in a particular order, the room itself is telling a story about resistance to corruption. The clean surface matters because the wound is open, but also because the room is being taught to think in surfaces. Dressings matter just as much. Linen, once folded, carries softness, yet softness is not the point. A dressing is a boundary. It meets the body, absorbs what it can, and covers what must be protected. Towels soaked in solution may be laid on the patient, and a sponge may wipe hands during the operation. These movements are almost domestic in their familiarity, but their purpose is clinical. The cloth is no longer only cloth, it is a barrier between wound and room. In the older way, dressing simply meant covering. In the newer way, it means guarding, and that quiet difference starts to make surgery safer. The bottle of carbolic solution near the door sits between experiment and routine. Its presence is practical, yet provisional. Carbolic acid has a sharp smell, stronger than lamp oil, stranger than soap, and the scent clings to rooms where it has been used. Even so, the bottle marks an important shift. Cleanliness is no longer only wiping away what is visible. It begins to include an invisible barrier, an attempt to make the space itself less hospitable to harm. The door matters in a way that is easy to miss. Beyond it lie the corridor, the stair, the ward, the street, and the air shared by too many breaths. Inside, the table and tray form a smaller climate. A patient is brought in, and the room briefly changes its meaning. The threshold is not just architectural. It marks the place where the practical hopes of the hospital meet contamination. Once that problem is taken seriously, the room begins to look different even before any object is moved. The same floor, the same walls, the same windows now appear as part of the question. Cleanliness starts to include not only what rests on the table, but the passage of bodies into and out of the room. On a small desk or shelf, among notes and papers, a ledger waits for entries. Surgery does not end with the closing of the wound. It ends again later, when someone writes down whether fever appeared, whether the dressing was changed, whether the edges of the wound held, whether the patient recovered or worsened. These papers are plain, but they matter. They let repeated experience gather weight. They let a surgeon compare one case with another. They make infection less of a fog and more of a pattern, even before the deeper explanation is fully secured. The room is quiet before the work begins because it has already been worked over by many hands. Someone has swept it. Someone has arranged the linen. Someone has checked the lamp, the basin, the cloths, the table height, the door. Someone has carried out the used tools and brought in what is needed now. This repetition is part of the emerging discipline of surgery. It is not yet the rigid sterility of the later theater, but it is moving in that direction. The operating room becomes less like a place where a dramatic event happens and more like a place where conditions are prepared. That preparation is the heart of the change. The knife still matters, skill still matters, yet the room itself has begun to take responsibility. Not everyone welcomes that responsibility. Extra washing takes time. Extra cloths mean extra work. A solution that must be carried, poured, and handled can feel like one burden more in a profession already full of burdens. Some surgeons see complication where they expect straightforward craft. Others suspect that caution is being asked for in excess. The resistance is understandable. The old habits are not stupid. They are simply older than the new explanation. A surgeon trained in one way may not immediately welcome a second layer of invisible concern. Still, the room keeps presenting the same evidence through the same outcomes. Some patients recover, others do not. The difference, once noticed often enough, begins to change what counts as common sense. The antiseptic turn is not a single revelation. It arrives as a series of modest corrections. Cleaner hands, cleaner instruments, treated dressings, a spray or wash, a room cleared more carefully, a habit repeated until it feels ordinary. Joseph Lister stands within that process, translating a suspicion into practice, and then practice into argument. His work does not make surgery gentle in the modern sense, and it does not erase danger, but it shifts danger into a field where habits can be studied, compared, and improved. Prevention begins to share the stage with skill. Later, as understanding deepens, other methods join the room. Heat and steam take on a larger role. Surfaces are made easier to wash. The theater becomes more enclosed in its idea of cleanliness. Gloves, masks, and gowns appear as the century moves on. Yet in this earlier moment, the work is still fragile and human. The floor is not magical. The air is not pure. The table is only a table. What changes is the seriousness with which each object is treated. Linen is no longer just linen. A sponge is no longer just a sponge. A bottle near the door becomes part of a larger answer that has not finished arriving. So the room waits. The windows keep their pale light. The tray holds its instruments. The folded linen rests in its stack. The bottle near the door keeps its sharp, unfamiliar smell. A new kind of attention is entering surgery. One that measures not only the cut, but the setting around the cut. Not only the hand, but what has touched the hand. Not only the wound, but the room in which the wound is opened. In that quiet threshold, clean surgery begins as a practice of care before it becomes a rule. The change is modest enough to fit in a basin, a cloth, a ledger, a bottle, and the simple readiness of the table. Down the corridor, the ward settles into quieter work. Beds stand beneath high windows. A washstand holds a pitcher and basin. A casebook lies open on a small table. Folded linen waits on a shelf. A screen can be moved for privacy. Here, the question is, what happens afterward, when the body is no longer under the knife, but is still not finished with its trouble? In this room, time matters as much as skill. When Joseph Lister was a young surgical dresser, he moved through such wards on rounds. Old bandages were lifted away. Wounds were cleaned and redressed. Fresh linen was laid down. A note was made. Then the next bed was reached, and the same routine began again. The dresser stood between body and book, between injury and record. Repetition made the lesson plain. Surgery did not end when the operation ended. The wound had a second life, and that life unfolded in the ward. That second life could be delayed. A wound might look settled and then change after a day or two. A patient steady in the morning could be weaker by evening. The bandage might need changing again. Nothing obvious in the room had changed, yet the outcome had shifted. Trouble arrived later, quietly, in ordinary hours of watching. Pain relief had made surgery more ambitious, and the ward had to absorb the consequences. More complicated operations became possible, and more patients arrived needing afterward care. The theater made the opening. The ward tested the result. A successful operation could still be followed by a bad turn, and the room had to live with that contradiction. The ward was one place where medicine was forced to learn by outcome. Every bed offered a small experiment in waiting. The ward itself was a collection of ordinary objects made consequential by repetition. There were bowls for washing, cloths for drying, shelves for folded linen, and hands moving between them. Water had to be fetched, buckets carried, the floor kept in order, curtains shifted. A bell might ring at a bed, notes grew thicker. The ward was a working compromise, held together by habits of attention. Because no one yet had a convincing account of the hidden cause, many explanations lived side by side. Some blamed the air, some weakness, some the strain of the procedure itself. Some spoke of a body out of balance, others called it bad luck. None settled the matter. The ward had evidence, but not agreement. It could show when something went wrong, but not why similar wounds behaved so differently. That uncertainty was unsettling because the failures were not rare enough to dismiss. A wound that seemed straightforward could later become troublesome. A patient who had survived the operation could still decline afterward. The difference was in what came later. In the aftermath, the room had to manage. To the people working there, the problem sat in the bed, the dressing, and the hours after the round had passed. The body had not finished speaking, and the ward had to keep listening. The case book preserved that slowness. It did not explain the wound, but it fixed the sequence in ink. Bed after bed, day after day, one observation followed another. A dressing was changed. The wound was inspected. A patient was restless. Another slept. One recovery looked promising. Another did not. The pages did not create certainty, but they made comparison possible. The book kept a pressure the hand alone could not. It gathered time and made pattern possible. Lister's observation grew from that paper trail as much as from the bedside itself. He was comparing wounds, not just seeing one. He was seeing how the same practice could lead to different outcomes in different beds. The repetition of the rounds and the sameness of the room mattered. When the body was changing, the setting looked familiar enough to be ignored, and that is exactly why it became important. A single failure can be written off. A repeated failure starts to ask for a cause. If the same kind of trouble returns often enough, the mind begins to suspect something unseen moving through the hospital or being carried from one moment to the next. That suspicion did not require a grand theory. It only required patience. In a ward, the same bowls might be used again. The same cloths might pass from one task to another. Water was fetched, poured, and replaced. Hands moved the same route over and over. Washstand, bed, shelf, book, next bed. Ordinary labor in a shared room has consequences. One person's dressing becomes another person's environment. One person's recovery becomes part of the atmosphere around the next bed. That closeness made nursing and attendance especially important. Linen had to be changed without delay. Bandages had to be kept orderly, a clean cloth, a careful fold, a swift replacement. A patient shifted a little higher on the pillow, a basin carried away, and returned freshly rinsed. These small acts mattered because they repeated. The daily reality of the ward depended on other hands. The nurse or attendant who kept the linen moving and the bed in order was not a minor figure. The work was the room. Crowding made the lesson sharper. Beds stood near one another. Recovery was never entirely private. A patient could hear movement at the next bed, the scrape of a chair, the soft exchange of instructions. The ward made each body part of a larger collection. If one wound worsened, everyone in the room felt the shadow of it. If one patient failed, the failure belonged to the whole space in some small way. The same room held hope, uncertainty, and the quiet pressure of seeing too much. The language used for trouble was careful, but it was still incomplete. A wound might be called inflamed or irritated, or simply not right. A patient might seem to have taken a bad turn. These were observations before they were explanations. They named surfaces and outcomes, not causes. The staff could describe what was happening while still lacking a settled account of how it was happening. The result was disciplined uncertainty. People learned to watch for changes in color, comfort, the look of the dressing, the patient's strength, and the way the days were unfolding. This is one reason the ward becomes central to the later story of clean surgery. The question was never only how to make a neat cut, it was how to keep a healing body from being undone after the cut had already been made. The answer could not live only in the moment of the operation. It had to reach into the hours and days that followed, into the cloth, the basin, the book, the hands, the shared air, the sequence of rounds. The wound was not separate from the room around it. It lived inside that room, and the room shaped its chances. Once that was clear, the hospital could no longer be thought of as a backdrop. Even the uncertainty had a kind of order. One patient improved, another worsened, and the difference invited comparison. One bed stayed calm, while the next required extra attention. One dressing remained clean enough to leave alone for a time. Another had to be changed sooner. The ward became an education in difference. It taught that similar wounds were not always the same. It taught that a good result could not be assumed from a good start. It taught, above all, that the hidden cause of failure was real even before it was named. Its effects kept returning to the bedside. By evening, the ward settled into a quieter rhythm. The linen was folded, the cases were entered, the windows held the last light. A patient turned in bed. Someone crossed the floor with a basin. The book on the table held its small marks and notes, waiting for the next round. It was simply waiting in a practiced way. And in that waiting, the next clue was already near. It would not come from the knife. It would come from the room itself, from the old habit of noticing air, smell, and the things a hospital could sense long before it could explain them. That habit began with the window. In the early ward, a sash could be raised a little, and the room changed at once. Damp air came in from the street, carrying coal smoke, wet wool, and the faint mineral smell of stone after rain. Inside were beds, folded linen, a basin filled and emptied more than once, and the stubborn smell that stayed near a body recovering slowly. The room was not silent like a chapel. It held small weather, and hospitals learned to read it. To the people working there, smell was evidence. Fresh air suggested order. A close or sour room suggested trouble. When a wound turned offensive, the change in odor was often the first thing noticed. The language of the time kept returning to foulness, corruption, decay, and stagnation because those words seemed to fit what the senses found. They named not only a smell, but the condition of the room, the linen, the floor, and the air around them. The older explanation was bad air or miasma, the common way of naming danger before infection was understood. Disease, in that view, could rise from rot, drains, crowding, and heavy air. The idea was persuasive because bad smells often accompanied bad health. If a ward became close and damp, it was easy to suspect the air itself. That belief shaped routine. Windows were opened when weather allowed, floors washed, walls scrubbed or whitewashed, bedding aired, and buckets carried out. The work never finished because smell returned as soon as bodies returned. Freshness became a moral language, and a clean room looked like care. Outside the ward, the city kept feeding the same argument. There were drains under the streets, kitchens below stairs, stable yards, market carts, and people moving through narrow spaces. Hospitals sat inside that larger environment. Their doors opened onto corridors and courtyards, and their walls did not make a perfect boundary. A hospital smell was never only a hospital smell. It was joined to the town, and the town was joined to the ward. Still, air was too broad an explanation. It could accuse a whole building, a whole district, or a whole season, yet one bed might remain calm, while the next became troubled. One dressing might sour quickly, while another stayed as it was. The senses caught the difference, but not the cause. Smell pointed toward danger, but it did not tell anyone what had entered the wound, or why one patient failed and another did not. In the surgical room, smell gathered around objects. A basin held water gone cloudy with use. Linen absorbed what the eye preferred not to dwell on. Metal instruments cooled and warmed with the room, taking on its touch and then its memory. An apron could carry the trace of the last procedure. A table could keep the remaining odor of work done on it. Before bacteriology gave the issue a new language, surgeons and dressers learned to read these traces. A nurse did not need a theory to know that a basin used too long would smell wrong. The hand knew when water had gone stale, and the nose knew when linen had lingered too long. Some readings were sound. A sour smell could mean decay. A stale room could mean too many bodies and too little movement of air. A wet dressing that lingered too long near the bed could mean neglect. But the mind that follows smell is always in danger of reaching too far. Not every dangerous thing smells bad. Not every bad smell carries the same danger. The old explanations were useful because they tracked experience, yet incomplete because experience itself kept changing shape. Hospitals were trying, slowly, to become more exact places. Cases were compared, outcomes noticed, and practices argued over. A room that seemed better aired could not prove its own safety, but it could invite comparison with a room left shut. In that gap between what the nose said and what the patient later became, doubt lived. The old language also carried judgment. Foul air suggested disorder, neglect, or proximity to decay. Fresh air suggested discipline. Cleanliness mattered. Airing out a room mattered. Separation mattered. The mistake was to think that the smell of a room told the whole truth about infection. It told a truth, certainly. It was not the whole truth. By the middle of the century, a few physicians had begun to wonder whether something smaller than smell might be at work, carried by the air rather than created by it. That thought was not settled doctrine. It was a question, and questions can be more important than answers at first. A question changes where the eye rests, what the hand washes, what the surgeon fears to touch, and what kind of room feels trustworthy. Joseph Lister belonged to that generation, shaped by a medicine that still relied on smell and observation because infection had no settled account yet. The hospital taught through repeated failures as much as through lectures. Wounds could change by evening, and ordinary dressings could become urgent by the next round. A door opened and closed, a pail was lifted out, and a blanket was carried away. Why did one room stay tolerable while another soured? Why did one patient settle while another drifted toward fever or breakdown? The senses noticed the difference long before the theory did. For a long time, the answer stayed close to the old idea that the room and air had gone bad. That answer was not useless, because it captured the closeness between the ward and the people inside it. But it kept attention fixed on the atmosphere as a whole, when the deeper trouble might have been carried on a dressing, a hand, a tool, or something still smaller and less visible. The next years would untangle that problem by questioning the air itself. For now, the hospital still trusted its nose, with soap, fresh water, and a room aired after rain on one side, and the stale corner, unemptied basin, and cloth left too long on the other. Those judgments were not enough to solve infection, but they marked where the problem seemed to live. That is why the old explanations lasted so long. Built from the senses people had, and the rooms they knew, they could not see germs, but they could see the closed window, the wet linen, the crowded bed, and the air that felt held too still. In the hush after a round, the ward seemed to keep its own account, speaking in smell and heaviness and the slow change of air. On a wooden stand, a glass flask holds yeast water under the light. Its bent neck lets air pass while much of the drifting dust stays away. A small label sits on the glass, the kind of written note that turns an object into a record. In Pasteur's laboratory, the flask was not a curiosity. It was a question. If the liquid stayed clear when air alone reached it, but changed when dust and tiny living forms found a way in, then spontaneous change was not enough. Something had entered, something living had arrived. That vessel stood against a long habit of explanation. For generations, spoilage could be treated as a vague failure of matter, a kind of self-undoing when food, liquid or flesh was left too long to the air. Pasteur answered by comparing vessels, one open and one protected. The point was not that a flask could be pure forever, it was that protection and exposure could be made visible. Air was no longer life in itself, it was the road by which life might travel. The surface of the liquid looked almost ordinary, and that is part of why the experiment mattered. One clear vessel stayed clear, another did not. One could be labeled, set down, and left to time. Another could be opened to the room. The comparison made a theory out of waiting, and the laboratory became a place where the world agreed to be checked again and again. That distinction mattered because Pasteur was not only arguing about a bottle, he was rebuilding the meaning of fermentation. Beer and milk could go off because very small organisms multiplied in them. Yeast belonged to one kind of change, other microorganisms to another. The invisible world, once treated as a haze of decay, began to look ordered. Different forms of life could bring different results. That made the world less mysterious in one sense and more crowded in another. His work did not stay with liquids, it reached silkworm disease, and the smallness of the cause did not make the effect less serious. Liquids spoiled, cocoons suffered, meat decayed. The common thread was the arrival and growth of living agents within it. From there, the thought moved toward disease. If a broth could sour because living forms multiplied in it, then the body might also become ill because germs multiplied within it. It replaced a fog of corruption with an unseen population moving through living tissue. That was a hard thought for any age to accept. If disease had living causes, then disease might not be a fixed fate. It might be met, delayed, interrupted. The label on the flask, if the handwriting is to be trusted, marks August 1864. That small line of ink keeps the experiment from drifting into legend. It places the vessel in a datable world where a chemist could return to a result and compare it later. A vessel could be washed, heated, stoppered, opened, and watched, but without the written line beside it, the lesson would drift. The page held the result in place. The glass held the liquid. Together, they kept the answer from being lost. Behind the experiment sat the older debate about spontaneous generation, the idea that life might arise from non-living matter when conditions were right. Pasteur's reply was methodical. He made the difference between air and dust matter. A sealed or protected vessel remained one thing. A vessel open to the room became another. A narrow neck, a stopper, a cloth, a curve in the glass. These modest objects gave the invisible world a geography. Dust settled where it could. Life entered where it was allowed. The microscope belonged to the same habit of mind. In its case of dark wood and brass, with its lenses and eyepieces, it did not create certainty by itself. It trained the eye to accept that a liquid was more than it first seemed. A fluid could contain motion, residue, and tiny life moving at a scale that ordinary sight could miss. Under the lens, the unseen became thinkable without becoming simple. Pasteur was learning that living agents could be responsible for change. The method mattered as much as the idea. A flame, a stopper, a strip of cloth, a bend in the glass, a careful label in Pasteur's hand. Each object narrowed the experiment to a clear difference. One vessel could be left open to dust and microorganisms. Another could be shaped so that air entered but the particles did not settle. Time then became part of the evidence. The clear liquid stayed clear. The exposed one did not. Such work relied on repetition. Pasteur's experiments moved from beer and milk to meat and disease, from the factory and the kitchen toward the body itself. Once that pattern was seen, a hospital could no longer treat the air as merely empty space. The room around the patient had become part of the matter under discussion. For surgery, that consequence was especially important. A wound was an opening, and an opening made every nearby object matter. A dressing, a thread, a hand, a basin, a cloth laid across a table edge. These were no longer routine details, they became possible routes. If living agents could travel on dust or surface contact, then infection did not begin only inside the patient. It could arrive from the room around the patient. The question shifted from what a wound was to what had been allowed to reach it. In a hospital, that meant attention to edges, linen and hands, and reusable tools all sat at the border between the body and the room. If minute particles could ride on a sleeve or settle on a dressing, then the visible order of the room was only part of its safety. The new thought was quiet, almost unglamorous. The path of infection could be ordinary. The danger was not always a stain. Sometimes it was a transfer. This is why the idea reached surgeons slowly but persistently. It asked the surgeon to imagine a wound as something more than a cut in flesh. It was also a meeting place where surfaces, air, and living matter touched one another. Once that was admitted, dressings, washes, and the handling of instruments could no longer be treated as afterthoughts. A threshold had been named, and naming it made action possible. That threshold was the useful part for Lister. The important change was narrower and deeper. A wound might be defended if the living agents outside it could be kept from entering. The hand, the instrument, the dressing, and the air all belonged to the edge of the wound now. Prevention had become imaginable before treatment. The quiet flask on its stand had altered the meaning of the threshold. A casebook lies open beside a narrow window in Glasgow. Numbers, initials, and brief remarks run down the columns, and those columns matter because surgery is still trying to learn what happens after the knife has been put away. When Joseph Lister became chair of surgery at Glasgow University in 1860, the city gave him a hospital, a stream of patients, a teaching ward, and the steady discipline of paper. Recovery and failure sit on the same page. That is where the questions begin. From lecture room to infirmary ward, the day moved through corridors, stairwells, and doors that closed softly behind students. The university and the hospital were not separate worlds. One supplied language, the other supplied bodies, and Lister moved between them as teacher and working surgeon. A chalk mark on a board could become a bedside question. A bedside observation could return to the board for another test. Surgery was not only a craft performed before the patient, it was also an argument carried from room to room. Another room in the Glasgow years is easy to overlook because nothing dramatic happens there. The linen store holds folded sheets, towels, dressings, and aprons. Clean cloth is counted, stacked, carried, and returned. In a hospital, cloth is never just cloth. It rests on skin, absorbs fluid, carries warmth, and touches a wound at the edge where healing can be helped or hindered. For a surgeon learning to think carefully about infection, that ordinary fabric becomes part of the case. In the surgical ward, the bed is only the beginning. A basin waits on a chair. A tray holds scissors and bandages. A hand reaches for the dressing, pauses, then turns it over for another look. The first success of an operation could be undone by what happened in the following days, when a wound reddened, a fever rose, or the dressing failed to protect it. Lister watched those later days closely and followed the wound into its aftermath. The next day mattered as much as the first hour. Outside the hospital walls, Glasgow was busy with smoke, carts, damp stone, and the ordinary movement of an industrial city. People arrived from workrooms, streets, and crowded houses. They came with fractures, abscesses, and wounds that had already begun to trouble them. The city did not simply provide patients, it also provided a scale of consequences. A wound could keep a laborer from work, unsettle a household, and stretch a recovery across many days. Lister seems to have moved through these rooms without theatrics. His work depended on patience, repetition, and a willingness to ask the same question more than once. Students saw him in the lecture room and in the ward, where he could turn a single case into a lesson about detail. He wanted to know what happened to one wound compared with another, one dressing compared with another, one course after surgery compared with another. That way of teaching gave the hospital a place of measurement, and it taught the people around him to look more closely. A case was not just an example, it was something to compare, return to, and reconsider. Behind a desk that was never quite empty, the hospital's records were stacked in bound volumes. They did not argue quickly, they waited. A clerk could return months later, and the same name, notes, and outcome would still be there. Lister needed that slowness. He needed comparison. The record room made comparison possible and let him notice that the difference might lie in some small act that had been easy to ignore in routine. At home, the questions did not end at the door. Lister used a small laboratory there, and Agnes Lister assisted him as a partner in the work. The room would have held modest equipment, glassware, a row of small test tubes in a stand, and the careful order of objects that must be set down and picked up in the right sequence. What had been seen in the ward could be tested again in a private room, under a lamp, with more time for thought. That domestic discipline joined the family table to the hospital bed. Specimens prepared for study gave that private room its patient character. Lister had an interest in inflammation and in the way living tissue responded when something went wrong. A specimen did not argue, it only remained, and in remaining it could be compared with other things that remained. A series of wounds, watched in the same way, could show patterns. The microscope did not replace the bedside, it sharpened the questions brought back from it. In 1864, while working at Glasgow University, Lister encountered Pasteur's work on microorganisms. The idea was not yet accepted everywhere, but it offered a possible explanation for what had been troubling him. If living things too small to see could travel and multiply, then infection was not simply a matter of dirt in the ordinary sense. It was something more active, something that might enter a wound from outside. The wound was no longer only a cut in flesh, it was a place that had to be guarded. This is where the Glasgow years sharpen into a new kind of thinking. If the wound is a boundary, then the surgeon's task begins before contact and continues after it. Cleanliness is still important, but it is no longer enough to mean only tidy surfaces and careful habits. The edge of the wound has to be defended. The room, the materials, and the movements around the patient take on a new importance because they can no longer be treated as background. Lister's attention turns toward prevention. What had once been the operation itself now includes everything that prepares for it and everything that follows from it. The hospital did not change with him all at once. Some colleagues thought the added care looked fussy. Others were willing to watch, but not yet to change their own habits. That hesitation was ordinary. Medicine often trusts what has already been repeated, even when repetition only protects a weakness in the routine. Lister answered with more observation, more writing, and more patience. In Glasgow, evidence was not a single object. It was a set of relationships, each one checking the others. That effort gave Glasgow a particular place in the history of surgery. The city was not only a setting where a famous surgeon happened to work, it was the place where an argument about infection became visible in records, demonstrations, and clinical trials. The numbers in the ledger mattered because they made the question harder to dismiss. The same patient, the same room, and the same kind of wound could produce different results when small details changed. Lister's work did not rely on a single dramatic discovery. It accumulated, moving through cases, notes, and revisions. The hospital stopped being only a place where trouble arrived. It became a place where trouble could be studied. Glasgow gave Lister the scale he needed. Enough cases to test an idea, enough students to question it, enough rooms to carry the work from bedside to lecture room to home study and back again. The city kept its smoke, its rain, and its crowded life, but within that ordinary motion, a new discipline was forming. It was still fragile, still incomplete, and still easy to doubt. Even so, it had become possible to imagine surgery not as a moment of risk followed by hope, but as a chain of careful acts surrounding a wound. The next step would be more concrete and more controversial. In Glasgow, though, the ground has already been prepared. The page is open. The question has been written down. The page had been opened. The question had been written down. On the shelf beside the basin, the first answer was a small bottle of carbolic acid. It was plain and hard to admire, with a sharp smell that arrived before the liquid was touched. It came from coal tar and manufacture, not from linen, skin, or careful hands. Lister wanted a barrier between wound and air. In 1865, he began testing the acid on wounds, bandages, and surgical equipment. A dressing came away. The wound was cleaned. The liquid was applied. Then the days after the operation had to be watched. Not every attempt settled well. A chemical strong enough to act on decay could also be harsh to living tissue, so the work moved by adjustment. Less here, more there, different soaking, different covering, different handling. What mattered was not a dramatic sight, but a change in contact. In Lister's thinking, a wound was never just flesh, it was a place where the surrounding world might enter. If germs were part of the danger, then the answer had to be a barrier between the wound and everything that pressed toward it. That meant not trusting appearances. A surface could look clean and still carry what the eye could not see. A hand could look steady and still be part of the problem. A cloth could look harmless and still serve as a path. So the first experiments took place in the ordinary pressure of hospital work. There was no separate laboratory for the patient. No neat line between theory and practice. A basin sat near the table, forceps waited within reach, lint, a folded cloth, and the bottle itself made a small arrangement on the work surface. Someone had to write down what happened next. The wound's appearance, the discharge, the settling of the tissues, all had to be carried into the record. Lister had heard that carbolic acid was being used to treat sewage, and that rough origin gave it credibility. It was not beautiful or refined. It belonged to drains, yards, and industrial labor. Yet that was exactly why it drew his attention. If something could resist corruption in one dirty setting, perhaps it could interrupt corruption in another. The hospital did not need a fragrant remedy. It needed a material that could do one narrow piece of work reliably enough to matter. Its smell became part of the experiment. It was sharp, tar-like, and hard to ignore. It settled into the room and made the air feel less neutral. This was not cosmetic clean. It was a deliberate attempt to alter conditions around an operation. The bottle on the shelf, the sponge at the basin, the folded dressing, each one belonged to the same effort to keep infection from crossing a boundary. That boundary was the real subject of the first trials. Lister was not trying to make surgery perfect in a single leap. He was asking whether infection could be reduced by interruption. A wound that had been opened could not be made untouched again, but perhaps it could be guarded. Perhaps the cloth could be prepared in advance. Perhaps the instrument could be handled differently. Perhaps the hand could be brought into a new relation with the wound. The method began to form around those possibilities. The early steps were small enough to look modest and serious enough to reshape the room. A sponge soaking in solution, a bandage prepared before it was needed, a tool set aside after contact, a fresh cloth laid down in the right place. None of these looked decisive alone. Together, they formed a sequence, and that sequence was the beginning of a discipline. It was not a doctrine yet, it was a habit being tested under pressure, and pressure mattered. The hospital did not pause for the experiment. Wounds arrived, dressings had to be changed, staff had to remember what came first and what came after. Old habits were still close at hand. Speed had long been valued, along with endurance, and moving from one case to the next without much delay. Lister's approach asked for preparation, for stopping to arrange objects before action, and for a little more time before the first cut and after it. The result was not instantly smooth. Some wounds responded better than others. Some needed revision. That uncertainty did not cancel the experiment, it gave it weight. Lister had to see whether the acid could protect without doing more harm than good, whether the method could be repeated, and whether strength and restraint could be learned in practice rather than guessed at in theory. The case notes held that learning. They were not dramatic pages. Their value was repetition. A line for the dressing, the wound, the next day, the discharge, the settling of tissues, whether the patient had done better than expected. Paper like that keeps a method from dissolving into memory and gives the hospital a way to think in sequences instead of impressions. At the same time, carbolic acid changed the meaning of cleanliness. Clean now meant resistance to contamination. That small shift in language made a large difference in practice, moving care away from decoration and toward prevention. That attention spread through the room, one object at a time. The basin was no longer just for water. The cloth was no longer just cloth. The instrument was no longer just a tool. Each thing took on a role in keeping the wound apart from what might spoil recovery. The hospital remained the same building, but in the narrow space of the dressing table, a different logic had started to take shape. It was still fragile and easy to doubt, yet the first experiments had shown that a wound might be protected by arrangement, not only by speed or luck. That was enough to keep returning to the table and to make the next case worth trying. In that sense, the bottle on the shelf mattered more than its size. It marked a shift from hope after the fact to care before the damage spread. It gathered the hands, the cloth, the notes, and the basin into a single line of effort. The room had not become sterile. It had become deliberate. And once surgery learned to be deliberate about infection, it could not return quite unchanged to the older way of doing things. A shallow tin held the dressings, folded into squares and stacked with care that was almost domestic. Linen, bandage, soft lint, the packets needed for the next round. None looked heroic, yet Lister's hospitals were teaching people to treat them as part of the operation itself. The tray was no longer a place where useful things waited by accident. It was part of the procedure. The cloth was not merely a covering, it was a boundary. The packet of dressing was a decision about what the wound should meet and what it should not. In that small shift, surgery lost some of its old looseness. Linen folded in advance, basin standing ready, notes placed where they could be read again. That order continued after the incision. A wound was not left to settle on its own and then forgotten. It was covered, watched, and returned to at intervals that had to be learned. The dressing became a record of how the body was answering the operation. Cloth, bandage, skin, and the notes of surgeon or dresser belonged to the same slow conversation. The wound would speak again on the next round, and the next. Recovery could be read in small changes, not only in dramatic turning points. A dressing that stayed sound, a wound that stayed quieter, a patient who did not slide at once into decline. These were signs of a new way of thinking. Even the thread had to be reconsidered. In 1869, Lister introduced catgut ligatures, a material the body could absorb once it had done its work. It was a small change in the tray, but meaningful in the wound. The object did not remain as a stubborn foreign presence. It disappeared. Lister kept returning to the same idea. Let the body keep what it can use and remove what it cannot. The ligature belonged with the linen and the bandage. Each object had to justify its presence and leave as soon as it could. The tray was becoming less like clutter and more like an argument for restraint. The hands of the staff were folded into the same discipline. Lister used weak carbolic hand washes for surgical staff, carbolic baths for the instruments, and towels soaked in carbolic solution laid on the patient. A sponge soaking in the same solution passed over hands and instruments during operations. Washing was no longer a side matter. It belonged to the line of defense. The basin, the cloth, the metal tray, the wash itself. Each had to earn its place by reducing risk. The system asked for slower attention. Then came the spray, the most visible ritual and the easiest to remember. By around 1871, a donkey engine with a long handle let an assistant pump carbolic acid into the air during longer procedures, easier to manage than the earlier hand spray. The aim was to lessen germs in the space around the patient. In practice, it laid a yellow mist over the room and brought a sickly sweet, tar-like smell. It was unpleasant enough to stay in memory. Yet for a time the spray carried force, because it made the unseen feel as though it had a shape the staff could work against. The room had to adjust to that machinery. The assistant became part of the theater's rhythm, with the lift of the handle, the settling of the mist, the pause before the next cut. In the old surgical room, danger had often been treated as a vague atmosphere. Here, the atmosphere was being given a task. The spray did not invent the system, and it did not remain the whole answer, but it helped staff imagine the air as something that could be altered. A hospital changes by changing the way people think about space, touch, and time. For the people at the bedside, the new routine was smaller and more personal than the published debate suggested. The nurse or dresser had to keep the used cloth apart from the fresh one, the basin apart from the tray, the washed instrument apart from the one still waiting. It was patient work, almost clerical in its repetition, but the repetition was not empty. It taught the room to behave as if contamination could move from one surface to another and had to be interrupted. Once learned, that idea could be carried from bed to bed without much speech. A glance at a folded towel or a wet dressing could tell the story. The hospital was learning a new memory, held not only in books but in arrangement. What belongs where, what stays separate, what must be changed, what can be trusted for another day. The case books began to matter in a new way. A wound that settled under a dressing, a limb that did not slide into decline, a patient who recovered after the operation instead of after the fever. These were not dramatic scenes, but they accumulated. Lister published his findings regularly, and surgeons read them beside the daily work of the wards. Some argued with him or misunderstood him, but the records kept growing. The infections fell. The practice spread. What had seemed excessive to some became ordinary to others, first in Glasgow, then far beyond it. The word ordinary changed. It no longer meant careless, it meant repeatable. The system worked because it did not depend on one perfect gesture. It spread its labor across many small objects. The air was treated, but so were the hands. The hands were treated, but so were the tools. The tools were treated, but so was the cloth over the patient. And the cloth was not enough unless the wound itself was watched after the operation ended. Lister's antisepsis turned the operating room into a chain, and every link had to keep for the next to matter. A bandage did not merely cover, it separated. A wash did not merely rinse, it prepared. A note did not merely describe, it measured the distance between danger and recovery. Later bacteriologists and surgeons would show that dry heat and steam could do some of the work once asked of chemicals, and the hospital would slowly move from antisepsis toward asepsis. That later room would be cleaner still, with less dependence on mist and more faith in exact preparation, separated tools, and carefully managed space. But it did not appear from nowhere. It grew out of the older habit of asking what the wound touched, what the hand touched, and what the room carried in the air. The carbolic era gave surgery a grammar of caution before it gave it perfection. It taught the hospital to think in layers. By the end of the round, the folded linen had been used, the basin emptied, the spray quieted, and the notes completed. The room looked nearly the same as it had before. The change had not arrived as a new building or a new machine. It had arrived as a sequence of small habits, repeated until they became hard to imagine without. Surgery was learning to be surrounded by care as carefully as it was carried out by skill. And the next change would move to the hands that washed, the instruments that waited, and the nurses and dressers who kept the whole arrangement in motion. At the small sink beside the theater door, the hands are given their own ceremony. Water is poured into the basin, the towel is straightened, and the fingers that will soon lift linen and steel are rubbed and dried with a patience that feels almost domestic. Yet nothing here is merely domestic now. In the hospital shaped by antiseptic practice, the hand has become a place of judgment. It can carry care, but it can also carry trouble. So the routine grows stricter. Wash, rinse, dry, avoid unnecessary contact, remember what has touched what, and keep the sequence in mind, even when the room is full. The surgeon's reputation may rest on the knife, but the room depends on the people who keep the water fresh and the cloths ready. Nurses and dressers move through a narrower world of basins, folded towels, small tins, and labeled jars. A patient entering the theater meets a ready order made already by other hands. The tray is aligned, the bandages are folded, the instruments are counted, and the basin waits in its place. Steel on a tray has a hard brightness under gaslight. If it is set down carelessly, left to dry in the wrong way, or passed from hand to hand without pause, the work becomes heavier. So the nurse or attendant wipes, arranges, and returns each piece to its place. Hinges are opened and closed. Edges are checked. Cloths are changed. What matters is that the tool be ready and clean enough for trust. There is a discipline to the tray that looks simple from a distance. In truth, it depends on memory, sequence, and quiet alertness. A missing bowl, a damp cloth, a jar set down too near a used surface. Any of these can disturb the small economy of the room. Nursing labor often lives in such interruptions before they become visible. A fresh towel is found. A pitcher is refilled. A lid is set back on. A tray is carried away and returned. The apron belongs to the same discipline. It catches drops, gathers dust, and takes on the pale trace of antiseptic fluid. Sleeves are rolled or arranged with care. Hands that move from ward to theater and back again carry traces of both, so the fabric becomes part of the system. It is practical clothing and a boundary. The nurse learns to keep fresh from used and clean from uncertain. The ward and the theater are joined by these crossings. Between them lie linen baskets, washstands, cupboards, and shelves where practical life is sorted into categories. Clean cloth is stacked separately from soiled cloth. Fresh water is kept apart from what has already been used. The separation is institutional, and it lets the hospital keep functioning. The linen room deepens that geography. Fresh sheets are folded into squares that can be counted with the eye. Used cloth moves out toward the wash. It is easy to miss how much of clean surgery depends on this traffic. A clean towel is part of the arrangement by which the next patient is met with something ready. Cupboards and drawers matter in the same way. A jar returned to the wrong shelf may not look dramatic, yet every small confusion invites a longer delay later. So the nurse memorizes where the lint sits, where the bandages are stacked, where the solution stands, which tin belongs to which task. Hospitals are made from these invisible maps. The person who knows them can move through the room without fuss, so the room can feel settled even when the work is heavy. This is why nursing becomes so important after Lister's ideas become established. Clean surgery is not held together by a single brilliant act. It depends on repetition. The same bowl must be filled again. The same hands must be washed again. The same dressings must be prepared again. A wound may be protected for a few moments in the theater, but the next hours belong to those who change cloths, observe what has happened, and preserve the order that antiseptic practice requires. The nurse is part of the timeline of the operation, not merely a witness to it. A notebook on a shelf gives that timeline a shape on paper. Entries are brief: a dressing changed, a tray cleaned, a roll used, a basin emptied. The page may seem plain, yet it holds the discipline of the room. The hospital learns that its own memory must be made out of small notations and steady habits. When the record is kept, the next shift can begin without guesswork. When it is neglected, the room slips back toward confusion. The nurse also becomes an observer. A dressing is not only changed, it is read. A cloth that has shifted tells one story, a basin another, and a patient's quietness or restlessness can matter as much as an instrument. It notices when a room begins to lose its order. In that way, nursing becomes an early warning system made of common sense and habit. The hand is both the instrument and the risk. It wraps a cloth, lifts a vessel, steadies a limb, opens a packet, and closes around a handle. Because it can do all this quickly, the new discipline insists on ceremony. Washing becomes a pause that rearranges the hand's relationship to everything else. The fingers, nails, skin, creases, and cuffs all enter the field of attention. The hand does not stop being human, it becomes more accountable. That accountability changes the balance of the room. The surgeon is still the one who cuts, but the nurse makes the cut possible by keeping the room from becoming one more place where chance can enter freely. The basin is heavy, the water grows cold, the cloths have to be changed when they are no longer fit. The smell of carbolic lingers on skin and fabric in a way that is practical rather than pleasant. Yet the unloveliness of the task is part of its value. It says surgery is supported by routine. The washroom has its own sound, quieter than the theater but not idle. Water strikes enamel, cloth is wrung out, a basin is carried back empty. The drain takes away what the room is finished with. The hospital learns to separate, carry, wash, and return. The instruments begin to look like responsibilities. They must be kept in order and not hidden by habit. A tool put back in the wrong place costs time. A surface not dried properly invites uncertainty. A tray not checked can carry a mistake forward into the next case. Nursing work is partly the art of preventing drift. Nothing is allowed to slide quietly out of its proper relation. This is one of the ways the hospital changes. It starts to depend on people whose skill is measured not only in sympathy or obedience, but in exactness. They learn where each object belongs. They learn which cloth must remain untouched until needed. They learn how to move through a crowded ward without carrying the wrong thing from one place to another. Their practice is physical, but it is also spatial. They understand the geography of contamination and the geography of care long before those words become common in every conversation. A corridor, a shelf, a basin, a trolley, a linen press, all of it is part of the map. Many of the people who do this work are never named in the same way as the surgeons they serve, yet hospital reform depends on them. Their skill sits in the wrist, the eye, and the habit of looking twice. A trained nurse can see at once whether a dressing has shifted, whether a cloth has been handled too much, whether a jar has been returned to the shelf in the wrong order. Such judgments are small, but they repeat all day. In that repetition, nursing becomes technical as well as humane, care, but also method. The patient usually sees only the finished surface. The bed is ready. The basin is out of sight. The instruments are in order. The apron is changed. The fresh cloth is folded. Because the work has already happened, the room can appear still. That stillness is earned. It is made from movement that is deliberate enough to disappear. The patient may never know how many small crossings were managed on the way to that calm arrangement, but the result is there in the room itself, in its quieter air, and its refusal to feel improvised. Night brings another round, softer and more exacting. The theater is cleared, the trays are gathered, and the basin is emptied. Linen is sorted once more. Soiled cloth is sent away. Fresh supplies are stacked. Nothing dramatic happens, but the next morning depends on it. The hospital is also a place of resets. Nursing makes those resets possible. Without that patient order, the antiseptic system would lose its shape. Later, heat and steam will take on more of the burden, and the methods of clean surgery will continue to change. At this stage, the work is still visibly made by people carrying water, folding linen, wiping steel, and keeping records. The objects are humble, but the task is large. The sink, the towel, the instrument tray, the notebook, the linen cupboard, the apron, the basin, all of them belong to the same slow reordering of hospital life. The revolution is quiet. It arrives through repetition, through exactness, and through the steady work of nursing that makes a dangerous room behave as if it has learned a new discipline. The resistance begins in the cupboard. A bottle with a paper label has to be fetched, opened, counted, and put back. Another towel is taken from the stack. Another basin is placed near the table. None of these things is remarkable on its own, and that is the point. A hospital changes through what can be repeated, and repetition can also meet refusal. Lister's work lived in shelves, keys, lists, and routine. In the committee room, the minute book lies open beside the ledger of expenses. The ink is neat, but the arguments are not. Carbolic acid means another line in the accounts. More washing, more bottles, more cloths, more time at the sink, and more attention. Hospitals can admire a result and still resist the method. One man reads the wound, another the cost, and a third wonders how many extra steps the room can bear. The objection is often plain. The new practice looks elaborate. It looks elaborate because it changes the air. The spray fills the theater with a yellow mist, a pungent cloud under the lamps and over the table. It has a tar-like sweetness, sharp enough to be remembered. Some surgeons who stood in that mist found it unpleasant. It could trouble the skin and the breathing. The apparatus announced the method. A long handle, a pump, an assistant's hands, the hiss of fluid forced into the room. A practice that aims at invisibility can still arrive loudly. That loudness mattered because the idea behind the spray was hard for many to accept. Not everyone was ready to think of infection as something too small to see. The older language of bad air and foul smells still lingered, while germs were invisible, so the chemical could be mistaken for a cure when Lister meant it as a barrier. If it sounded like a cure, it sounded exaggerated. If it was understood as a discipline for keeping germs away from a wound, it was something else entirely. That discipline asked for washing, soaking, waiting, and repeating. The hands of the surgical staff had to be washed with weak carbolic solution. The instruments had to be bathed. The wound had to be guarded by dressings prepared with care. Even the air was treated as something that might carry trouble. To a surgeon trained for speed, they felt like a burden. The work did not stop at incision. It spread backward into preparation and forward into dressing, as if the operation had grown longer than the visible act of cutting. The linen room became part of that extension. Towels soaked in solution had to be laid ready. Fresh cloths had to be kept apart from ordinary ones. Buckets, basins, and sponges took on administrative importance they had not carried before. The nurse and the dresser learned that cloth and basin were part of a chain of attention. In a crowded hospital that looked like extra labor, resistance often begins there, where a new idea becomes one more job. There was also the matter of what surgery had long trusted instead. A polished surface could persuade the eye. A quick wipe could persuade the hand. Steel, if it shone, could seem ready. But Lister's system did not ask only for shine. It asked for surfaces to be suspect until properly treated. Older instruments belonged to an earlier habit of surgery. The new way made the instrument tray answer to the bath, and the tray reminded everyone that cleanliness was a process, not an appearance. That kind of change is often resisted by people who feel clean enough already. The corridor carried the smell before the room did. A nurse could leave the theater and take it along on her clothing. A porter could pass the door and know at once that one of the carbolic routines was in motion. Aprons, curtains, and washed hands held the smell. Some objected because the odor was unpleasant, others because it was impossible to ignore. In a hospital where composure mattered, the pungency felt like a persistent intrusion. The matron and the ward staff had their own reasons to resist. Extra work has its own gravity. A bottle that must be measured carefully is one more thing to keep track of. A sponge that must be kept in solution is one more thing to remember. A room arranged for antiseptic work needs more coordination than a plain receiving room. Resistance lived in glances, delay, and complaints about ordinary hands. Some surgeons disliked the way the method seemed to change authority. Surgery had long prized steadiness, speed, and confidence. Lister's system introduced another kind of discipline, tying the surgeon to procedure and staff around him. The whole room had to move in concert. That could feel like a loss of freedom to a decisive surgeon. Yet the room had already begun to teach a different lesson. The wound depended on the whole arrangement of people and things. Resistance was partly a reaction against the idea that no single pair of hands could carry it. The casebook began to matter in a different way as well. Entries that once seemed routine now carried weight. Dressings, returns to the ward, the look of the wound, and the days after operation gathered into a record that could be revisited later. Hospitals are often persuaded not by speeches, but by what accumulates. A single good result can be dismissed. A string of them is harder to ignore. That persuasion is slow. One man says the method is fussy. Another says it is necessary. A third waits for a season of evidence. The misunderstanding of Lister's work made that waiting longer. If it was heard as a cure, failures were blamed on the chemical and successes on luck. If it was understood as prevention, the argument became more exacting. The point was not to rescue a wound after it had been invaded, but to keep the invasion from beginning in the first place. That distinction sounds neat on paper. Inside a hospital, it had to pass through habits, personalities, and tired trust. The new method arrived by repetition, and repetition changed minds. By the time some of the hospital resistance softened, another idea was already moving in from the edge of the room. If antiseptics could reduce germs on hands, instruments, and in the surroundings, perhaps the room itself could be arranged so that fewer germs entered. Heat and steam offered a different answer, one that moved surgery toward asepsis, a cleaner environment rather than a treated one. The spray, the wash, the bath, and the steam room belong to the same slow conversation about a safe theater. The resistance inside the hospital was never only a story of refusal, it was also the story of a building learning a new discipline. Bottles had to be ordered, towels had to be soaked, instruments had to wait, smell had to be tolerated, belief had to catch up with routine. It feels like a ledger line, a wash basin, a tray on a table, a hand reaching for the same cloth again. Yet those repeated gestures are where the old hospital loosens its grip. Room by room, shelf by shelf, it begins to behave as though the unseen world around a wound has finally been taken seriously. At the edge of the theater, beyond the bright table and folded linen, a smaller room keeps the instruments in order. A nickel-plated bath stands on the shelf, a sink waits beneath it. The lid closes with a dry little sound. Nothing in the room asks for attention, and that is the point. It is a place for preparation, the unglamorous work before anyone touches a wound. Lister's antisepsis made this room possible. The idea was simple in outline, if never simple in use. Keep germs from entering the wound by placing a chemical barrier between the patient and the surroundings. Weak carbolic washes for hands, carbolic baths for instruments, towels soaked in carbolic solution laid over the patient, sponges carrying the same sharp chemical used again and again during the operation. The room had to organize itself around one fact: infection came from outside, and it had to be met there. The carbolic spray gave the system its familiar atmosphere, drifting through the air as a pale yellow mist with a sweet tar-like smell. Later, it would be seen as unpleasant and toxic, but it also made a claim about the air around the wound. Around the table, steel instruments replaced older tools, and ivory and wood gave way to surfaces that could be washed. The nickel-plated bath and catgut ligatures pointed the same way. Fewer hidden places for dirt. That was the practical genius of antisepsis. It did not ask the surgeon to rely on appearance or habit. It asked for sequence. Wash the hands, soak the tools, lay down the towels, wipe the instruments, keep the dressing damp with the right solution, repeat. Cleanliness was no longer only a virtue, it became a method with steps, limits, and consequences. Beyond the theater, another room received the used cloths, kept apart from the clean stack. A fresh towel was only fresh if it stayed separate from the used one. A clean tray was only clean if it did not rest beside what had already been handled. The hospital began to work in paths and crossings, in what had to be kept apart and what might be brought together. That habit of separation mattered, because a chemical mist was only a partial answer. It saved lives, but it was not the final answer. As bacteriology gathered strength in the later 19th century, the question changed. The useful question was no longer only how to weaken germs around the wound. It was how to build a room where fewer germs entered at all. Robert Koch's work helped open that door. Dry heat and steam sterilization could kill germs as effectively as chemical antiseptics. Cleanliness did not have to rely on smell, sting, or mist. Heat and order could do part of the work, and the room itself could be prepared. That is where asepsis begins. In the aseptic room, the aim is to create a sterile environment using heat, soap, and water, and a stricter habit of design. The walls are made easier to wash. The floors are kept simple. Storage is chosen for cleaning rather than ornament. Flat surfaces matter because they do not hide so much. The room becomes less like a furnished chamber and more like a tool that can be scrubbed. Gowns, caps, and shoe covers become part of the routine. Cloth is no longer only a comfort or a sign of profession, it is part of the barrier. The body entering the room is prepared just as carefully as the instruments and the linen. The surgeon and the staff carry less of the outside day in with them. Nursing work changes with it. The person at the basin, the hand that opens a wrapped tray, the orderly who keeps the used cloths moving away from the clean stack, all become part of the same chain. A covered tray, a fresh wrap, a dry towel, a clean shelf, a basin with the right contents, each seems modest on its own. Together they make a room that can be trusted more than before. The older carbolic method does not vanish overnight. Some keep the spray because it is familiar. Some keep the hand wash, some keep the bath for instruments and adjust the rest around it. Change in medicine, like change in any institution, comes through layers. One shelf is cleaned, one cupboard is replaced, one habit survives while another is added beside it. What makes asepsis different is not that it rejects antisepsis, it grows out of it. Antisepsis taught surgery to think about infection as something that could be managed in the room. Asepsis took that lesson and moved it earlier into the preparation of space itself. The wound remained important. The room became important too. The tray, the towel, the floor, the shelf, the gown, the lid, the basin, each joined the work of safety. The change altered the feel of the operating theater. Where the earlier room fought contamination as it appeared, the newer room aimed to lower the chance of its arrival. One is defensive and immediate, the other is patient and architectural. The first reaches for a chemical answer, the second asks the room to be arranged wisely before the first instrument is lifted. That wiser arrangement depends on plain surfaces and honest materials. Enclosed corners give way to surfaces that can be wiped. Storage stands open enough to be cleaned. The place where instruments rest no longer wants to collect dust in hidden seams. A polished tray, a fresh gown, a dry towel, a clean floor underfoot. Each object suggests that the room has already been thought through. The operating theater becomes a setting where order is functional, and it is repeated. A basin is filled, a sleeve is rolled, a surface is wiped, a cover is pulled straight. Nothing looks grand in the moment, yet the room is being taught a new habit, learning how to avoid giving infection an opening. Even the smell of the place changes by degrees. The tar-like edge of carbolic does not disappear at once, but the room is no longer built around it. Heat, soap, water, and washable surfaces carry more of the burden. The old spray remains in some places as a familiar aid, but it is no longer the central figure. The cleaner room asks less of the air and more of the shelves, the cloths, the coverings, and the way each object is returned to its place. By the time this way of working had spread more widely, clean surgery depended on an environment disciplined in advance. That is why the shift from antisepsis to asepsis matters. It is not merely a change in terminology, it is a change in where the work is done. The work moves from the wound to the room, from rescue to preparation, from reaction to readiness. And so the smaller room beside the theater settles into its purpose. The instrument bath is lined up, the towels are folded, the surfaces are plain enough to be wiped again. Somewhere beyond the door, the larger room waits for its next use. Before the first cut, before the first cloth is opened, before the first hand reaches across the table, the room has already begun to keep faith with the patient. It has been made ready, and so the smaller room beside the theater settles into a harder kind of order. Readiness is no longer a single moment, it becomes heat, waiting, and the discipline of keeping things apart until they are needed. The room is no longer only where articles are laid out before an operation, it is where they are made fit to cross the threshold. The walls are smooth, the floor can be washed without ceremony. Shelves keep little except what belongs there, and a sink waits under the light with a drain to take the water away. The surfaces matter because they must endure repetition. Tables are wiped, trays carried back, doors opened and shut with care. Nothing is meant to look precious, it is meant to be dependable. Lister's antiseptic world depended on chemical protection at the wound, on dressings, sprays, and carbolic acid. The sterilizing room belongs to a later confidence. It trusts that safety can begin before the instrument reaches the table. The shift from antisepsis to asepsis is gradual, a rearrangement of habits, roots, cupboards, and hands. The machine at the center of the room is not graceful, but it is exacting. A metal chamber stands by the wall, heavier than the cupboards around it, with a door that closes with a purposeful sound. There may be dials and valves, steam enters, time is counted, and pressure adds discipline. The chamber is there to make the load pass through a controlled change. Heat reaches places a cloth cannot, hinges, joints, serrations, grooves, and wrapped corners. The room answers that hiddenness with something larger than the hand. It gives the tools a cycle rather than a rinse. A tray of instruments can be arranged, closed, and carried in. A bundle of linen can be wrapped, heated, and brought out again. Metal, cloth, and paper do not behave alike, and the room learns the difference. There is something almost domestic in the folding that happens here, though the purpose is stern. Towels are stacked, gowns bundled, dressings sorted into sets. The parcel is legible. Someone has counted it, tied it, and marked it for a route that does not pass through the wrong hands. By the time it reaches the theater, the effort has disappeared into its neatness. That neatness belongs to a wider path through the hospital. Used things return one way, prepared things leave another. Laundry, service corridor, washroom, sterilizing room, storage shelf, theater door. The path matters almost as much as the object. A trolley carries one kind of load back from a ward, another carries a different kind forward. The building begins to split into cleaner and less clean traffic. The boiler house and the laundry gain new importance in that arrangement. They are not glamorous places, yet surgery begins to depend on them. Linen that once seemed only housework becomes part of operative order. Boiled cloth, washed gowns, and treated dressings join the hidden support of the theater. Clean operation begins much earlier than the incision. Paper enters the process as well. A ledger or notebook records what was sent in, what came back, what needed repair, what load was delayed, and what stock was low. The page does not make the room clean, but it keeps it accountable. It lets a department know what happened to a set of instruments and when a parcel was last prepared. The sterilizing room is not only a room of heat, it is a room of counting. That habit of counting belongs to the movement that made bacteriology easier to believe in hospitals. Once unseen causes of infection are taken seriously, the building itself becomes more important. Rooms are no longer just settings, they are filters. A corridor can carry risk. A cupboard can keep a safer parcel. A cloth can be prepared in one place and opened in another. Prevention spreads backward through the hospital, away from the patient and into everything that reaches the patient. The people who keep this room going are often not the people who receive the greatest attention. Nurses, attendants, and technical workers carry trays, watch the chamber, and keep the shelves in order. They know which parcels are ready and which are not, how long a load has sat, whether a wrap has stayed dry, whether a tray needs another turn. Their work is repetitive, patient, and usually invisible. When it succeeds, it leaves almost no trace except readiness. That invisibility can be misleading. It can make the sterilizing room seem secondary, as though the theater were the true center and this only the support space beside it. In practice, the opposite is becoming true. The theater depends on the room beside it, the way a sentence depends on its grammar. If the instruments, linens, and roots are in order, the operation begins with less uncertainty. Steam itself has a strange place in this history. It is practical and intangible at once. It rises, disappears, and leaves only warmth behind. That makes it a useful emblem for the period. The older hospital might have trusted only what the eye could see, what the nose could detect, or what a strong smell seemed to promise. Steam asks for another judgment. It offers a process rather than a perfume. This is why the sterilizing room feels like a bridge between two ideas of surgery. One still thinks in terms of washing away danger after it is near. The other tries to keep danger from entering the room at all. One is reactive, the other is preemptive. Hospitals move between them for a long time. Chemical antisepsis does not vanish overnight, and steam does not solve everything by itself. But the direction is clear. The theater becomes more dependent on preparation, and preparation on rooms that were once easy to overlook. The room beside the theater therefore changes the whole building. Its shelves, chamber, sink, and ledger begin to matter in the same breath as the table under the lights. It is a place where heat has been given an office, where linen, metal, and paper each receive a different kind of attention, and where order is practical rather than decorative. Nothing in it needs applause. It only needs to be ready again tomorrow. The hospital is no longer relying on courage alone, or on cleanliness as appearance, or on smell as a verdict. It is learning a more exact routine. The instruments come through a room of steam. The cloth comes through a room of steam. The record is kept. The door opens. The theater receives what has already been prepared. In the next shift of the story, That discipline begins to show in the theater itself, in the habits of the people who enter it, and the expectations they bring with them. For now, the sterilizing room stands nearby, warm and occupied, turning water and heat into a more dependable kind of promise. What has been prepared in the warm room behind the door now reaches the theater as expectation. A brass latch, folded linen, a covered tray of instruments, a basin, and a clock. The room is still a theater, but its culture is changing. Work begins before anyone touches the table. The surgeon enters at the end of a sequence, not the beginning. Hands have been cleaned, tools have been heated or bathed. The door is a boundary, and the room learns from what comes in and what is kept out. Joseph Lister's antiseptic system gave that sequence a shape. Weak carbolic washes for staff, carbolic baths for instruments, and a spray in the air around the patient were meant to keep germs from the wound. The point was not to cure infection after it settled in, but to make the wound and the space around it less welcoming to the unseen causes of disease. That was a change in culture as much as in technique. The theater no longer existed only to display a procedure. It was responsible for the air, the cloth, the hands, and the tools that entered it. The spray itself was awkward, hanging in a pale haze with a tarry smell. A later pump with a long handle let an assistant keep it moving through long procedures. For a time, someone was assigned to keep the mist alive. Cleanliness still had to be made visible before it could become ordinary. Not everyone accepted the arrangement. Some surgeons found it excessive and complicated. Others treated carbolic acid as though it were a cure itself. Hospital culture changes slowly by argument, habit, and the force of results. The objects in the theater changed with those expectations. Steel instruments became more common after antiseptic methods were in regular use. Before that, some were made from ivory or wood, materials much harder to clean. A nickel-plated sterilizing bath stood ready for surgical tools. Cleanability became a professional virtue. Lister's introduction of catgut ligatures in 1869 belongs in the same story. Made under his direction by a local chemist, they were meant to be absorbed by the body after doing their work. Even small bindings had to fit controlled preparation. The theater was becoming less improvised and more exact. By the 1890s, bacteriological work shifted the emphasis again. Heat, steam, soap, water, and controlled handling increasingly offered ways to prevent contamination before an operation rather than depend mainly on chemicals after exposure. The balance between antisepsis and asepsis changed. Antisepsis still mattered, but now the aim was to prepare a cleaner environment from the start. The room was learning to begin from cleanliness as a condition, not as a correction. That change reached outward into the corridor. The route from the sterilizing room to the theater became part of the procedure. The covered tray mattered, the folded linen mattered, the hand that opened the door mattered. A door that had once simply separated one room from another now carried a rule with it. The theater became a place of exact movement, where the sequence from washing to heating to carrying to opening had to be respected. Cleanliness was part of the machinery of care, as important as the table itself. The people inside the room changed with it. Nurses, assistants, dressers, and surgeons all held the routine together. Hands were washed and scrubbed, instruments ready, linen handled carefully. One person lifts, another receives, a third checks the tray. The sequence moves forward without haste, because haste now carries its own risk. The room left less space for spectacle. The old operating room had been closer to a stage, where the surgeon's confidence could dominate the space. The modern theater asked for repetition, method, and rules that survived from one case to another. It made the room steadier. The answer was becoming collective rather than individual. Method replaced bravado, and patience replaced flourish. Even the sounds of the room would have changed. Steam, polished steel, a tray set down in the right place, clean linen, quieter movement. The carbolic mist belongs to one moment, but it does not remain forever. As aseptic habits spread, the theater's atmosphere felt less like a chemical experiment and more like a disciplined workshop. The air itself was part of the work, but it was no longer the only thing that mattered. The culture shift also altered authority. A surgeon could still be brilliant, bold, and fast, but the room no longer belonged to bravura alone. It belonged to repeatable preparation. That meant published findings, shared procedures, and routines that others could follow and test. Lister's own practice of developing techniques through experimentation and clinical trials mattered here. The theater was becoming a place where a method had to prove itself over and over. That change lasts longer. The room begins to care about consistency, and consistency is a form of mercy. A small set of objects captures the shift neatly: the basin, the tray, the sterilizing bath, the folded cloth, the steel set, the bottle of carbolic solution that gives way to heat and soap. Each item marks a stage in the same movement. Surgery, as a dramatic event, is giving way to surgery as an organized environment. The audience is smaller, the routine is larger. The room no longer asks only whether the surgeon can work there. It asks whether the room itself can do its part. That question reaches into the surrounding hospital. Cupboards, washrooms, linen stores, and corridors begin to matter more because the theater depends on them. The culture of clean practice spreads outward from the table. What happens in one room changes the expectations in the next. A folded cloth in the right drawer, a clean basin in the right place, a route that does not invite confusion. All of it becomes part of the same discipline. This is why the story of clean surgery is not only about a famous surgeon, it is a story about rooms learning how to cooperate. By the end of this change, the theater feels less like a place where a strong personality imposes order and more like a place where order is built into the room itself. That does not happen overnight, and it does not happen everywhere at once. Some habits remain longer than others. Some people resist more than others, but the direction is clear. The theater has become a room that prepares for itself. It remembers what it is for. It receives only what is past the earlier gates. And because it has learned that habit, the papers nearby can begin to count what the habit changes. The figures will matter soon. For now, the room keeps learning its new way of being. In the quiet after the work is done, the theater does not look grand. It looks prepared. The basin is empty. The tray is covered. The linen is folded again. The door between the steam room and the theater is closed softly, and the room rests under its own rules. That rest is new. It comes from a culture that trusts heat, water, routine, and shared discipline more than improvisation. Soon, record books would make the pattern plainer. Here, the room is still teaching itself how to be clean. The evidence did not arrive like a revelation. It came into the hospital office as a stack of copied returns, each sheet pressed flat beneath a paperweight, waiting for a careful hand. The room was small enough to keep its own weather. Ink stood in a dark bottle. A ruler lay beside the ledger. The pages were ruled into narrow columns for names, dates, operations, and endings. Nothing in the room was dramatic. That plainness was part of its authority. The steady feel of work meant to outlast opinion. A clerk turned the pages one by one. The numbers were not abstract to him. They belonged to beds, wards, the day a wound was dressed, the day a patient did not return. In the record room, voices became dates and results, and that severe reduction protected a pattern memory would blur. What had seemed like a suspicion in the corridor could now be traced across a quarter, a season, a year. Lister knew how hospital life could make the latest case feel like the whole truth. A surgeon remembers the last failure with unusual force. A recovery can look like luck, and a death can feel like a single misfortune. The ledger refused that comfort. It set one period beside another and asked for comparison. Before the antiseptic routine was settled, the pages carried one weight. After it was introduced, the same kinds of cases looked different in the totals. The argument had moved out of the theater and into arithmetic. The ward books held the detail behind the totals: amputations, fractures, abscesses, and other operations, plus dressings changed, drains checked, rooms aired, instruments washed, hands prepared, and patients watched in the days after. The pages did not tell every story, but they showed whether the method was being used with care. The quiet discipline of the routine left its mark in the columns. That was the point at which evidence stopped being impression. A clean-looking ward could still be dangerous. A confident surgeon could still be wrong. A patient could seem to heal and then fail later in the week. The mortality records kept those endings from being forgotten. They forced the hospital to count what it had once rounded off into inevitability. When later pages showed fewer deaths and fewer familiar infective complications, the difference was not a rumor. It was a repeated shape in the ink. The books made the hospital look back over months, not moments, and kept the later days in view when memory would have let them fade. In that patient accounting, the method had to answer the same question again and again, until the answer was no longer a feeling, but a pattern on the page, and in the ward beyond it, at last. The shape did not persuade everyone at once. Some surgeons trusted their senses and habits, and could point to exceptions, crowded wards, weakness, and other reasons for failure. Those objections remained, but the ledger only waited, and that made it harder to dismiss. The record room had silence, not emptiness. A blotter, a bundle of returns, a penknife, string, softened pages. Hospital paper is worn by repetition, and a line copied one week becomes a reference the next. In that repetition, the antiseptic method looked less like a new theory and more like housekeeping with serious consequences. Lister's published work gave those measurements a public life. He set the old routine against the new and asked readers to compare mortality. The case could travel into a journal, across cities, into another surgeon's hands, and into the mind of someone who had never stood in the ward. The hospital report became a vehicle, and the table became a portable room for the argument. That changed how success was spoken of. Surgery was not judged only when the wound was closed or the bandage tied. The later days mattered. A patient who avoided infection and the old hospital dangers changed the meaning of the operation. Success stretched into the nights after the theater, the dressing changes, the basin, the nurse, the linen, the washing, and the room kept in order. That wider measure gave everyone near the bed new responsibility. The surgeon was not enough by himself. Dressers prepared skin and instruments, nurses kept routine, attendants brought clean water and removed what was spent. The ledger did not name them, but the outcomes belonged to their habits as much as to the surgeon's hand, making the record a collective mirror. Once a hospital trusts its records, it inspects its habits more closely. A row of deaths cannot be shrugged off as weather, and a better line demands explanation. Dressing, instruments, routine, antiseptic barrier. These are not glamorous questions, but they make a practice durable, and the pages kept asking them. The figures also carried the method beyond the building. A table in a report could cross a city. A skeptic could ask for more proof. A supporter could point to the rows. The debate had something more stable than anecdote, a public trail that let one hospital's experience be compared with another's, while operating room secrecy loosened under published results. This mattered because the change was not only about one chemical or device, it was about method. Carbolic acid gave Lister a starting point, but the records showed the real issue was consistency. The same wound could not be compared honestly unless routine stayed steady enough to read, and that made counting a moral lesson as well as a statistical one. The numbers did not settle every disagreement. They did not erase the habit of trusting what looked tidy or make every wound safe. Some wards remained difficult rooms, and some hospitals were crowded and old. With poor airflow and stubborn arrangements, no reform could quickly undo. Yet the ledger made those limits visible. It showed which problems belonged to the building, which to the routine, and which to the unfinished understanding of infection itself. That is why the evidence belongs in the archive as well as the theater. The theater teaches by doing, the records teach by repeating. Between them lies the slow turn from hope to habit. Lister's method began in wound dressings and carbolic washes, but it gained permanence when the mortality books answered in a different tone. Fewer deaths in one set of returns, cleaner recoveries in another. A pattern that could be checked again. The figures did not sing, they accumulated. By the time the pages were recopied into a formal report, the hospital had begun to speak in a new register. It could no longer pretend that every operation belonged to the old uncertainty. The evidence was not perfect and not finished, but it was enough to shift the burden of doubt. The next rooms in the story would need cleaner walls, cleaner heat, cleaner instruments, and a cleaner way of thinking about the air itself. For now, the ledger closes, and the quiet arithmetic of survival remains on the page. In the narrow room behind the theater, the brass spray apparatus still sits, glass bottle empty. It once stood by the doorway, where everyone saw and smelled its mist. Now it shares a shelf with wrapped linen, an instrument tray, a folded cloth cover, and a basin with shine on its rim. Lister's method did not stay fixed. Its devices were revised, simplified, and sometimes set aside. What lasted was treating infection as something managed by care, routine, and evidence. That habit had limits. It depended on repeated attention, which was not certainty. Carbolic acid could be hard on hands, harsh on tissues, and heavy in air. Keeping a wound under it was exacting, and not every hospital could keep that for long. Rooms were crowded, staff hurried, supplies uneven. Infection did not travel by one clean route and leave by another. It moved through hands, cloth, instruments, air, and the ordinary traffic of hospital life. However earnest the method, it could not seal every opening at once. The smell of the solution announced intention, but intention was not enough. The old spray could seem awkward, and its ritual mattered as much as its substance. A surgeon could be exacting and still lose a patient to something not yet understood. A nurse could be careful and still face a wound that did not behave. The change came from making people look, measure, compare, and doubt. It did not give a perfect answer. It gave a better question. In the record room, the answer began to shift shape. Ledger pages, casebooks, and mortality tables changed the burden of argument. An operation once recorded as a gamble could now show a pattern. One ward compared itself with another, one year with the next. Failures no longer had the old freedom to hide inside custom. The numbers did not make surgery safe, but they made the old explanation less comfortable. If a hospital could count what happened after an operation, infection became a problem with a history. As bacteriology matured, the hidden world received names. Once manat life could be named as a cause. Surgery could move toward more exact ones. Antisepsis had opened the door. Asepsis stepped through it. The new aim was not only to fight contamination after it appeared, but to keep it from entering at all. It asked for cleaner hands, tools, cloth, surfaces, and a cleaner route through the room. A steam chamber or a sterilizing room beside the theater gave that idea a body. Heat replaced mist as the emblem of control. Metal lids, wire baskets, wrapped parcels, and smooth trays moved through it. It worked by patience and repeated certainty. Instruments no longer had to pass through a cloud as though air were the enemy. They could be prepared through washing, packing, heating, and careful carrying. The goal was not to stain the room with medicine, but to keep it from collecting what did not belong there. The operating theater changed with that idea. Surfaces became easier to clean. Hidden corners were less tolerated. Furniture had to answer to washing, not ornament. The room moved away from a crowded stage and toward a controlled workplace. People entered in a more ordered sequence. Trays, linen, and water had their places. The room asked for fewer gestures and more habits. Vigilance became part of the design. The work also spread beyond the surgeon's hands. Nurses, attendants, laundresses, porters, and house staff carried much of the burden of new cleanliness. They managed linen through washing and mending, kept storerooms from becoming careless, and moved basins, cloths, and packets without letting them wander into disorder. Lister's legacy was a redistribution of responsibility through the hospital. Not every hospital could move at the same speed. Not every surgeon accepted the same methods. Some places kept older rituals longer because they had no money, room, or consensus about what counted as better. Elsewhere, the new methods arrived in fragments, one practical habit at a time. A hospital might keep the carbolic smell while changing linen handling, or abandon the spray but keep careful exclusion. Progress was not a straight corridor. It was side passages leading away from old confidence. That unevenness shows Listerism survived incompleteness. It did not need the first spray apparatus to endure. The deeper lesson was that infection belonged to material conditions, and those could be changed. The system taught surgery to think in surfaces, roots, fabrics, and timings. It made the room itself part of treatment. Later generations could simplify the method and correct weak points. The transition from antisepsis to asepsis was not a rejection of Lister. It answered the limits of his first tools. The older system made contamination visible enough to fight. The newer one tried to reduce the places where contamination could begin. That is why the legacy feels larger than the spray, and even than the smell that once announced modern surgery. It survives in the expectation that tools should be prepared, cloth clean, rooms arranged with contamination in mind, and success depends on more than the incision. The records changed too. Casebooks and mortality tables did not simply prove one man right. They trained hospitals to watch themselves. They made comparison a habit. They turned outcomes into something discussed in wards and lecture rooms, not memory or reputation. A hospital that once relied on confidence could now be asked for evidence. That was cultural as medical. It made surgery less dependent on one figure and more on a shared institution. Students learned how to prepare a room, not only what to cut. They learned small movements repeated without fuss, and that order in the theater mattered before the first instrument touched the field. It lived in trays, wrappers, basins, and hands moving through a room. It settles into the memory of a profession as a standard. Standards are how revolutions become ordinary. The brass spray apparatus in the side room begins to look, in that light, like a relic from a beginning. It did not fail because it was foolish. It belonged to a moment when surgery was learning its enemies' names. It showed that invisible life could matter in the making or the breaking of a wound. Later methods improved on it, but they did not erase the road it opened. The hospital could put the spray aside and still keep its lesson. Cleanliness is not decoration, and a room can be arranged to protect life. What remained was a quieter discipline. Steam stood in for spray. Wrapping stood in for show. Washable surfaces, prepared instruments, orderly movement, and records began to seem like common sense. That is how the legacy settles. It does not stay brilliant for long. It becomes ordinary. A basin is placed where it should be. A tray is covered. A linen packet remains intact. A room is kept from what does not belong to it. The old uncertainty does not vanish, but it loses its authority. The brass fittings are kept because they mark a threshold that had to be crossed. The wrapped linen waits. The sterilizing room does its work without ceremony. Beyond the door, the theater is no longer trying to impress the eye. It is becoming a place of arrangement, restraint, and repetition. Lister's system did not end the story of clean surgery. It taught surgery how to continue. In the linen room, folded cloth sits in plain stacks, tied for the theater, the ward, or the table where instruments are set out. A porter carries them along a corridor that has become part of the hospital's daily circuit. Clean surgery has moved into laundry, storage, and timing. It is the order of small things, kept in place, repeated, rather than staged. On the instrument trolley, steel has replaced materials that were hard to clean. A nickel-plated bath waits for the tools. What had once been made from ivory or wood now has to endure boiling, scrubbing, and drying. The metal surface can be rinsed, wiped, inspected, and returned to use without carrying yesterday with it. The instruments are made with cleaning in mind. Beside the tray sits a short length of catgut ligature, one of those practical details that becomes ordinary only after it has already changed a great deal. Lister introduced catgut ligatures as part of his antisepsis techniques, and some was made under his direction by a local chemist. It is meant to do its task and disappear. The carbolic spray still has a place in memory, but not the place it once held in the room. It filled the air with a pungent mist and made the theater smell terry and sweet. It was useful for a time, and then increasingly awkward. Some surgeons found it unpleasant to use. It is less central now because the hospital has learned the air is only one part of the problem. Hands, instruments, dressings, clothing, and surfaces all ask for attention. By the 1890s, bacteriology had given hospitals another kind of confidence. Robert Koch showed that dry heat and steam sterilization were as effective as chemical antiseptics in killing germs. That changed the working day. Steam could work in a separate room, heat could reach instruments and clothing, and soap and water could stand beside antiseptics. What had looked like a chemical battle was turning into a system of rooms, routes, and routines. Steam could do quiet work in a separate room. Heat could reach instruments and clothing. Soap and water could take their place beside antiseptics. The operating suite itself begins to look different from the old theater. It is no longer only a single room with a table at its center. It includes changing rooms, scrub areas for staff, and preparation and recovery rooms for patients. One room is for entering, another for washing, another for the procedure, another for recovery. Infection control starts to resemble a path through a building. At the entrance to that path, clothing changes, coats are removed, sleeves are rolled, sterile gowns appear, along with caps and shoe covers. The people inside are dressed for containment. Hair, cloth, skin, and dust keep their distance from the wound. The habit becomes regular. Dull is the point. The nurse's work follows its own timetable. Hands are washed, instruments are checked, towels are placed, and the sequence repeats until it feels like housekeeping with consequences. Florence Nightingale's training school had already helped make hygiene a matter of instruction rather than instinct, and hospitals took notice when wards and charts showed sanitation could save lives. The result was not a sudden conversion. The older arguments remained in the building, but daily labor taught what speeches could not. In the ledgers, the signs of success are modest: fewer infections, shorter delays while wounds settle, less upheaval after an operation. Figures copied from wards and folded into administrative files begin to look less like controversy and more like maintenance. Lister had once responded to criticism with statistical evidence from his wards at Glasgow Infirmary. Now that same habit of counting has spread into the practical business of running hospitals. Supply lists, linen returns, dressing inventories, and instrument set records sit beside one another. The older argument about cleanliness does not vanish, but it loses some of its edge. Some critics had said that ordinary hygiene was enough. Others thought Lister's procedures were too elaborate, too dependent on carbolic acid, too much like a nuisance dressed up as science. Then antisepsis joined bacteriology and sanitation, and the discussion changed shape. The hospital had learned to use washing, heat, antiseptics, careful storage, and discipline together. The result was a more reliable environment. That new environment changes the feel of the people inside it. The surgeon is no longer a solitary figure carrying the full burden of risk. The modern team gathers: surgeon, scrub nurse, anesthetist, assistants. The room itself helps. Walls are washed, floors can take water, and storage keeps dirt from settling in corners. A clean room is not just a clean room. It is a piece of medical thinking made physical. The old carbolic apparatus, once a sign of boldness, now feels like a transitional object. It mattered because it marked the moment when surgeons stopped relying on hope and began trying to control the environment. But in the ordinary hospital, the spray is less memorable than the sink, the boiler, the towel rack, and the wrapped tray waiting on the shelf. Sometimes, the great change looks like a room that can be wiped down and used again. Ordinariness in medicine does not mean innocence. Infection remains a risk, and the room stays alert to it. The point is not that danger has disappeared. The point is that danger has been narrowed into procedure. Wounds are covered, instruments are sterilized, clothes are changed, and the theater is reset. The patient no longer enters a place expecting disaster. The building has learned a different expectation. It can prepare, proceed, and recover without staging drama around every task. By this stage, Lister's work no longer belongs to one controversial campaign. It has settled into the habits of the ward, the supply room, the laundry, the theater, and the training school. That is the fate of many medical revolutions. Their names remain, but their force disappears into practice. The cleanliness of the room is no longer an argument, it is a common expectation. The theater becomes ordinary, not because it is dull, but because it is ready. The next tray can be opened, the next pair of hands can enter, wash, and work. What once needed explanation now needs only continuation, and then on to the next quiet task. That is the quiet victory in the hospital. Not the end of uncertainty, but a routine strong enough to carry it. Lister taught surgery how to continue, and clean surgery had learned to speak the language of habit. After the last case of the day, the theater loses its audience before it loses its tools. The upper benches go dark, the rail is empty, the table stands under a small light with no one bent over it, and on the shelf a capped bottle sits beside a folded cloth. The sharp smell of carbolic caution thins into soap, damp linen, and the dry wood of evening. Nothing in the room is theatrical now. A bucket rests near the sink, a brush lies across the rim. The basin has been emptied, though a pale ring still marks the waterline. A nurse or attendant wipes the metal, gathers the cloths, and sends what must go to wash. The work is repetitive, almost stubbornly so, and that is what gives it strength. The room is not being admired, it is being returned. The shape of the theater matters to that return. Surfaces are chosen because they can be reached. Corners stay spare, cabinets close without fuss, shelves do not keep much. The room is built less like a stage than like a place that can be reset. A tray comes in wrapped, is opened, is used, and leaves again. Linen comes in clean and folded, leaves dirty, and comes back through the laundry. Clean surgery depends on those routes as much as on the hands that move along them. In the small office nearby, a case book waits on a desk. The pages are ruled. The entries are brief: a complaint, a dressing, a note about recovery, a result. At night, the ledger can make the day look smaller than it felt, but the book has a quiet power. It lets one operation be compared with another, one ward with another, one season with another. Infection, once blamed on bad luck or bad air, begins to leave a paper trail. That trail belongs to Lister's legacy as much as any bottle or spray. His antiseptic method came into hospitals as a challenge to older habits and older guesses. Carbolic acid, the spray apparatus, the dressings, the washing of wounds, and the handling of instruments asked surgery to think differently about contamination. The surgeon was no longer simply brave. The surgeon was responsible for a chain of preparation. Courage remained, but it was joined by method. Over time, that method changed shape. Antisepsis was not the final answer, only a bridge. As asepsis gained ground, the aim shifted from fighting contamination after it appeared to reducing the chance that it appeared at all. Once the hospital accepted that unseen agents could move from surface to surface, the clean room became a matter of barriers, order, and preparation. Heat, steam, and careful handling took a larger place. Instruments could be boiled or otherwise sterilized. Dressings could be prepared with more care. The smell of the spray was no longer the whole signal of vigilance. Later, work also moved into a sterilizing space, a washroom, a linen room, and a laundry. A wrapped set of instruments moved through the corridor by plan, and laundering cloth became part of protecting the wound. What looked domestic was also technical. Hands became part of that wider arrangement. They had to be washed, dried, and set to work again. Aprons changed. Basins were refilled. Sleeves were rolled back. The routine was not dramatic, and it did not need to be. It belonged to the daily life of a hospital, to the boring and necessary labor that keeps one person's care from becoming another person's danger. Nursing, cleaning, carrying, folding, counting, all of it found new importance in the wake of Lister's reforms. The hospital itself began to look different when ordinary work was given that purpose. The porter carrying a tray, the nurse laying out bowls, the cleaner wiping a surface, the clerk closing a book, each took part in the same chain. Lister's ideas survived because they could be shared. They did not demand a single spectacular gesture. They demanded small acts, repeated in the right order, with enough patience that the order would become habit. At night, the theater shows that habit in reverse. The last instrument goes back into its case. The cloths are counted. The basin is drained. The stool is tucked beneath the table. The lamp is lowered. The room does not sleep exactly. It waits. In that waiting, cleanliness disappears from view, which is another way of saying that it has become reliable. There is a kind of mercy in that reliability. Surgery never became simple, and the unknown did not leave the hospital. But the room no longer welcomed avoidable harm in quite the same way. That change altered how confidently operations could be planned, how calmly staff could prepare, and how much trust could be placed in a clean table and a clean dressing. The danger did not vanish, but it was no longer invited. The records continued to gather in quiet stacks. Mortality books, ward notes, supply lists, and reports all carried the echo of the change. Numbers could be argued over, but they still mattered because they let hospitals compare practice with practice and year with year. Prevention, preparation, and routine became words in medicine. The old language of corruption and invisible foulness did not disappear in a season, but it lost ground to habits that could be seen, taught, and checked. That is why the empty theater matters. A wall to wash, a floor to clear, a tray to wrap, a clock to keep the schedule, a sink to keep hands in place. Outside, the hospital deepens into its rhythm. Clean surgery has become ordinary. The theater is empty now, but ready.